question I'll ask this to start. Has anybody here beside me ever seen the movie Local Hero? If you haven't, it is one of the, it's top 5 all-time movies. It's just wonderful.
It's good.
And the plot of Local Hero, part of the plot of Local Hero, is that there's a small town in Scotland that this oil company believes would be a really great place to put in some huge crude oil terminal. And so they send this young whippersnapper up to this tiny town in Scotland to essentially negotiate the purchase of the town. And the irony in it is that he thinks that the town is going to really resist this, when it turns out the town thinks our life here is just totally dreary, and here's this gold mine, and how are we going to really soak the oil company? So it turns out that the young whippersnapper falls in love with the town in northern Scotland, and all this, and hilarity and variety of things ensue. But it's a very, I think it's a really sweet movie. But what this discussion reminds me of is sort of the local hero phenomenon a little bit here, which is, and now I'm getting to the actual question, which is, what do people in rural communities think of this? I mean, I was thinking about job searching. You know, one of the concerns that I gather that people have in states like Iowa, Wisconsin, is that people are moving out. You know, does this make it easier for people to move out? And people say, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, because there's huge benefits. Otherwise, I'm not saying we should block it if someone wants to, you know, if this stuff becomes available. But I just sort of wonder about the rural sociology of this, whether or not if you make it easier for people to find jobs in the big city, get out, and so on and so forth, whether this is going to lead to the dissolution of these communities. Or the flip side of it may be that people don't have to leave because they can get what they want in these other places. They could be teleworking and all sorts of things, and that sort of thing, although, so again, maybe it's just my nature, I suppose, to ask a sort of slightly contrarian question, but I sort of want to throw that out to people here who know way more about this than I do, which is whether there's anybody who's arguing on the other side that if we're, you know, are we adding more grease to the skids of the dissolution of these communities by doing this stuff?
How would you react to that?
Well, I would say the train has sort of left the station. I mean, I think the days of anyone sitting down and finding jobs through classified ads are over.
You're right.
And so I think it's just the reality that we do have Monster.com and every other capability now that every person is using. That's just the nature of how jobs are found in the marketplace today. So I think those are very good questions, but they probably have been a little too late in coming, because right. I think we have this new infrastructure in place.
And in terms of how increasingly education is delivered, education
Correct.
that would train or retrain.
So people don't have to leave for that.
Exactly, and in fact, it's not a well-known part of the National Broadband Plan, but there's a big section in there dealing with distance education and the role of government, in which government has always had a role to play in education. But clearly, a lot of these things will make everything more efficient, and I think that's what we're trying to get at in terms of delivering as much as possible to as many people as possible.
Yeah. How about questions from the audience? Yeah.
Well, just let me, for Tim's question, we have really concrete data. There was a massive survey of the 9 counties in southwest Indiana, and overwhelmingly, they're the little town in Scotland. They really want high-speed broadband. Yeah, and see it as a benefit and as something to help keep their kids there, not send them away.
Good.
So whether they're right or wrong, but they're the townspeople.
Oh, that's good.
We know that. The other thing I just mentioned quickly is the telehealth program was a closed program. They may have tweaked it since, but when it came out 2 or 3 years ago, those fibers went from hospital to hospital and were not allowed to be shared, not even to a doctor's home, so he could.
Right, and that has been tweaked.
But the new program,
right, exactly.
We got a big chunk for wiring our hospitals. We got 2 big chunks to to wire our community colleges. And in fact, down in Southwest Indiana, those explicitly have to be shared.
Right.
They have to create, although they're going to like 18 anchor institutions, they have to create 400 highway interchanges and offer service so there's some improvement. Even as the National Broadband Plan is scaring our rural telecoms from taking the next round of our US funding, some things have gotten better.
Interesting. Who else? Yes.
You know, one of the issues with the rural broadband is when you ask the question, there's an assumption that nothing has been done there. Right? And the reality is the rural electrics have been doing lots and lots of broadband. And so if you ask what percentage of rural America still is unserved, what is it?
Small.
7? I mean, it's a small percentage.
And,
so,
and shrinking.
And shrinking. And so in my mind, in a simplistic sense, it's does every citizen in America, particularly in rural areas, have a right to have access to broadband? I don't know the answer, but in its simplest form, that's the question. And there are models that say not necessarily. I mean, the rural electric model is a perfect one. You know, it's universal service, but if you live 15 miles from the nearest feeder, you got to pay the 15 miles of line to get to your house. Or if you live 100 feet off the road, they'll pay it. So it's not that there's no models out there, and it's not in telecommunications, it's in rural electric, and that's been since the 1930s. That's not a new thing. So it's interesting that they haven't adopted some of these other models as a way to look at how to solve the problem.
Well, also the National Broadband Plan is not necessarily a national residential broadband plan, although there are elements of that. But there's a lot, as I said, dealing with community anchor institutions. So in a rural area, you might have a library system that feeds 15 rural communities. The idea isn't necessarily that each of those communities will have it, but the notion is you're going to have an anchor institution which will have that. And we've seen that clearly in how libraries have reformed themselves. Even without broadband, we now have massive sharing of data between libraries. Most libraries are now part of consortia. So it really will sort of accelerate that process and be able to bring in more into rural communities.
Let me go to a more basic question. We keep talking about this stuff, public-private sector. Let me go back to the more basic question. What's the role? We talked yesterday a little bit about municipal getting in the business of broadband. What's the role of government, state, local, federal, in terms of filling in gaps? And then I guess the second half of that is, if they do fill in the gaps, what happens when it becomes economically viable, when the next delivery system comes along and private says, hey, I could do that very cheaply, and you've got this legacy municipal or federal or state system in place that's already delivering.
Yeah, I mean, if I were king of the world, I would flip the broadband plan. I would take the long-term goals and make them the short-term goals, and the short-term goals moving to the long-term. Meaning that the long-term goals are the ones that are affecting these large segments where we know government has a role. Public safety, health, education, things. I think there's a broad political consensus to say government does have a role here, and this is not a matter of, you know, the marketplace essentially functioning, we're filling a gap here. And we have Medicare, we have Medicaid. Those are systems in place. So I would start with those things first, and I think that there would be a ripple effect in jobs as well, so you would get some real results. But a lot of what's being talked about is more in the sort of narrow framework of where do we fill the gaps, is the marketplace working? I would go to the larger public purposes first, and then go into some of these marketplace areas. And it might also help solve what you're raising, which is maybe 2 or 3 years from now, the technology will have been moved further along so that those gaps will look a lot different than they do today.
Well, with that, I know we're up against a break at or time at 1:30. Tim Brent, Stuart Broadman, how about a round of applause?